At the company anniversary party, I saw the boss pull my wife to dance and end up kissing her in front of everyone, and in that instant, I felt the ground disappear from under my feet. There was no argument, no scene, I just turned and walked away, certain that it was over. "You weren't supposed to see it like that," she said later, too late. And as simple as that sentence was, I had never heard anything so cruel from someone I'd believed loved me until then. It was as if the mistake wasn't the betrayal itself, but my presence. I shouldn't have been there, I shouldn't have seen it, I shouldn't have disrupted the moment. It shattered me. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, it was moral, it was a silent mutilation of everything we'd built. The worst thing about being betrayed isn't the stolen kiss, it's the love returned in tatters. It's realizing that the gaze that sought you out in the crowd is now lost in the eyes of another, that the laughter you used to provoke is no longer yours, and that everything that seemed eternal can end in seconds of carelessness. I left without making a fuss, but inside me, everything screamed. Every step to the car was a battle not to turn around, not to beg, not to ask why. But the answer was there, written on her lips, in the embarrassed eyes that didn't meet my gaze, in the complicit silence she shared with him after the kiss. They knew. They knew they were wrong, but they chose to do it anyway. And me? I was just a spectator to a love dying in public. It took me weeks to remove the ring from my finger, but years to remove the pain from my chest. In her every gesture, I searched for traces of the woman who loved me, but all I saw was a shadow of someone I no longer recognized. She cried afterward. She tried to justify herself. She said it was a mistake, that she felt lonely, that I was distant. But love isn't negotiated in moments of need. Love is a daily choice, not a temporary distraction. She lost me there, in that dance, in that kiss, in that exposed abandonment. Time passed, and little by little I learned to live without her. It wasn't quick, nor was it easy. Sleeping alone, eating alone, remaining silent when before we'd talk until late. The house became a temple of heavy memories. But one day, unexpectedly, I found someone. Someone who didn't look away as they walked with me, someone who didn't mince words to let me know they were there, someone who didn't need to be tested to prove they were trustworthy. It was strange, at first, loving another person after having been broken into so many pieces. But true love, the kind that takes its time, that cares, that builds, has the power to glue together even what seemed irreparable. With her, I learned that respect isn't a gift, it's a foundation. That affection isn't begged for, it's offered. And that when someone truly loves, they never make you feel like an option. As I began again in silence, she faced the echo of her choices alone. Her boss, the same one who had shamelessly kissed her in front of everyone, was also the first to walk away when the party lights dimmed. He didn't want commitment, he didn't want questions, he didn't want her. It was clear that, for him, it was just a convenient fling. And for her, it was the beginning of a void that all the apologies in the world couldn't fill. She slowly discovered that the glow he displayed in public was nothing more than a reflection. And that, behind his self-confidence, there was a man who only knew how to win, but never knew how to stay. She realized she had traded a solid love for a liquid illusion. That she had traded presence for promises, and respect for adrenaline. She tried to move on. She tried to recover. She tried to find herself. But everything she touched seemed to crumble. Our mutual friends, once so present, slowly drifted away. People, even when they say nothing, have condemning looks. And it was in those looks that she understood that sometimes, consequences come not with shouts, but with silence. Time, which heals all, also takes its toll. And she began to feel this weight in the long early mornings, on lonely Sundays, on the dates that were once ours and now were hers alone. She sought me out later. Not to get back together, but to try to understand. "Why didn't you fight for me?" she asked. And I, with the peace that only time brings, replied, "Because those who love don't betray. Those who betray don't deserve to be fought for." It was on that day that I realized that forgiveness is freedom. Not for the other, but for myself. I forgave her not because she deserved it, but because I deserved peace. But what destroyed her most wasn't my absence, nor her lover's rejection. It was the day she decided to take the trip we'd planned together for years alone. It was a long-held dream, a coastal town with cobblestone streets, colorful houses, and a sunset that seemed hand-painted. We'd always talked about taking this trip for our wedding anniversary. She went. And when she got there, she saw everything we'd envisioned. She sat in the restaurant where we dreamed of dining, ordered the wine we'd chosen together years ago. And then she saw an elderly couple holding hands, toasting a life of complicity that time hadn't taken away. At that moment, the wine turned sour in her mouth. The food lost its taste. And she understood that this trip was, above all, a memorial to everything she'd lost. She cried alone at that dinner, her eyes watering and her chest tight, because she realized that what we had was real, strong, built on respect. And that she destroyed it all for a moment of vanity, for an unresolved need, for an irreversible impulse. In that moment, she didn't just miss me. She missed who she was when she was with me. Because I loved her in a way that made her love herself. And now, alone in that city of broken dreams, all that remained was the echo of a love she killed with her own hands. Meanwhile, I lived in peace. Not with the feeling of victory, but with the serenity of someone who knew how to start over. Of someone who learned that self-love is also made of limits. Of someone who understood that some losses aren't defeats, they're deliverances. And that, sometimes, the best way to love is knowing when to walk away. Time has taught me that you can't come back from certain mistakes. And it learned, too late, that no love survives when respect is left behind. But there was a day, a single day, when our paths crossed again. And something happened. Something neither of us expected. Something that would change, forever, the way we see everything we experience. And it is from there, that this story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal, we expose it. All the stories are fictional, but the feelings they provoke are real. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal destroys, corrodes, and leaves deep scars on the souls of those who truly love. Prepare to immerse yourself in an intense story, full of emotion, loss, and irreversible choices. Take a deep breath, what you're about to hear is simply, shocking. Lucas was never a man of grand speeches. His silence spoke volumes, and perhaps for that reason, few people truly knew him. He worked as a project coordinator at a mid-sized technology company, where his competence was noted more for its results than its charisma. He was practical, objective, discreet. But there was something in his gaze that caught one's attention, a kind of serene melancholy, as if he had already lived too much, as if he carried a baggage of emotions and memories that didn't fit into casual conversation. Lucas wasn't the kind of man who stood out in a crowd, but once noticed, it was impossible to forget him. He was the kind of person who did everything carefully, who listened attentively, who valued the small gestures. And that was precisely what enchanted Laura. Laura had a glow. Not the exaggerated glow of someone who wants to be the center of attention, but a light of her own that came from the way she walked, the way she touched things, as if everything around her deserved delicacy. She had curious eyes, an easy smile, and an intelligence that revealed itself not in complex sentences, but in the right questions. She worked in the marketing department of the same company as Lucas, and their paths crossed for the first time in a meeting that, for anyone else, would have been just another one. But there, amidst graphs, goals, and PowerPoint presentations, something was born that neither of them could explain. It wasn't love at first sight, but a kind of silent connection, a kind of kinship that seemed to have been rehearsed for years. It took months for their first dinner outside of work. There were quick coffees, hallway conversations, lingering glances during meetings. Then, one night, after a simple get-together, Lucas invited her to walk to the subway, even though his car was parked right next door. They spent 30 minutes walking the city streets, unhurried, without plans. And there, amid shy laughter and childhood stories, a feeling was born that they would only be able to name much later. When they started dating, it was as if everything took on a new meaning. Lucas, so reserved, began to open up, revealing layers few had seen. Laura, in turn, found in him the support she had always sought, a safe haven amid the chaos of everyday life. They built a routine that, to many, might seem simple, but to them, was full of meaning. They had a favorite coffee on Sundays, a movie they watched whenever the world seemed to fall apart, a unique way of hugging each other at the end of the day as if to say, "I'm here." Lucas loved watching Laura read, her eyes fixed on the pages, her breathing calmly, the way she frowned when she became too engrossed in the story. Laura, on the other hand, was enchanted by the way he tended the plants in the apartment, talking to them as if they were part of the family. They shared dreams, fears, playlists. They didn't need much to be happy, just being together was enough. Friends commented on how perfectly the two seemed suited, and even the most skeptical admitted there was something special there. It wasn't a theatrical relationship, full of exaggerated displays. It was something deep, rooted. The foundation was built every day with simple choices, making each other coffee before leaving for work, leaving a note with a bad joke on the bedside table, sending a text in the middle of the afternoon just to say, "I just thought of you." And although neither would say it outright, they both knew, they had found something rare. When they decided to move in together, it wasn't an impulsive decision. They talked, planned, weighed the pros and cons. But deep down, they knew it was the natural step. The apartment they chose was small, but full of windows. Laura loved the morning light that flooded the living room, and Lucas was enchanted by the sound of birds in the early hours of the day. They decorated everything together, carefully, blending styles, stories, and memories. It was their home. They had difficulties, of course. Fights over finances, small quirks, bad days. But they were never the type to shy away from talking. They learned to listen to each other, to compromise, to apologize. They knew that love was not immune to wear and tear, but they believed that, with respect and will, it was possible to weather any storm. Laura, over time, grew professionally. Her natural talent for dealing with people, her sensitivity to understanding the market, and her sharp creativity made her a reference in the industry. She began participating in larger meetings, more ambitious projects, and her name began to circulate frequently in the halls. Lucas, although proud, felt a certain distance forming. Not because Laura wanted to distance herself, but because time began to run out. Lunches became rare, dinners more silent. And although there was still affection, laughter, and intimacy, something felt off. He tried to understand, tried not to demand it. He knew she was at an important moment in her career. But deep inside, he felt a tightness that was difficult to explain. She, on the other hand, carried a mixture of exhaustion and pressure. She wanted to handle everything, excel at work, be present in her relationship, maintain ties with friends, take care of the house, and take care of herself. And, in the effort to balance everything, she lost herself a little. She no longer smiled with the same lightness, no longer paid attention to the small details that once gave her pleasure. Lucas noticed, but didn't know how to help. He told her he was there, that she could count on him, that she didn't have to carry everything alone. But an invisible barrier was growing between them. A wall of silence, of avoided topics, of accumulating fatigue. Still, there was love. It was undeniable. In simple gestures, there were still traces of the couple they had been. One hand on top of the other on the car seat, a blanket pulled back in the middle of the night, "Take care," said automatically. But the intensity had changed. It was as if they were in a dimly lit room, where they could still see each other, but with difficulty. And it was in this scenario of emotional turmoil that the opportunity arose to participate in an important company event. A party that would bring together the entire team, clients, and partners. A moment to celebrate the results achieved in the last quarter. Laura was excited. She needed this, needed to feel alive, recognized. Lucas, a little more introspective, didn't show the same enthusiasm, but he insisted on accompanying her. He knew he was important to her. He knew that, even from a distance, he was still the man by her side. They got ready together, just like old times. She spent hours choosing the right dress, experimenting with hairstyles. He watched her with that mixture of admiration and longing, as if he were seeing a version of herself that hadn't appeared in a long time. And for a moment, everything seemed back to normal. They laughed in the car, discussed the event's playlist, and joked about their coworkers. That night, the room was packed, the music loud, the lights dancing across the ceiling. Laura moved familiarly through the space, greeting people, exchanging smiles. Lucas remained nearby, observing, sipping slowly, trying to stay present even though he didn't quite feel part of that universe. Amidst toasts and speeches, glances and conversations, what no one knew was that that seemingly banal night would be the breaking point for everything they had built. Because sometimes, it's not a major tragedy that destroys a relationship. It's a gesture, a look, a moment that changes everything forever. And that night, something happened. Something no one expected. Something that would forever change the path of those two. But before the fall, there was silence. There were doubts. There was a story built with tenderness, with care, with true love. And that's precisely why everything hurt so much afterward. In the week leading up to the party, the atmosphere between them was strange, but still shrouded in a veneer of normalcy that prevented any fuss. Laura spent more time outside than inside, always busy, always connected to something or someone on her cell phone, laughing on calls Lucas didn't know about, talking about projects he no longer followed. When asked, she always responded kindly. There was no rudeness, just a distance rooted in prolonged silences and a lack of interest in sharing what was once common. Lucas felt like a visitor in her own home. He was still the man who made coffee in the morning, who left her coat ready on the armchair, who made the bed just the way she liked it, but the reciprocity seemed increasingly automatic, increasingly mechanical, as if loving had become a chore. She, in turn, hovered between anxiety and excitement. There was a gleam in her eyes that Lucas recognized from other times, but he could no longer pinpoint its source. He tried to convince himself it was work, that perhaps she was finally finding fulfillment where she'd always sought it, but a part of him knew there was something more. Her clothes were bolder, her perfume more striking, the messages exchanged on her phone were frequently deleted, and when he passed behind her during a call, her expression changed. It wasn't paranoia, it wasn't unfounded jealousy, it was the instinct of someone who knows the other person deeply and knows, without proof, that something has shifted. On the night of the event, everything seemed carefully rehearsed. The venue chosen by the company exuded sophistication, with amber lights reflected in tall mirrors and waiters gliding among the guests with trays of glasses and fine appetizers. Laura looked stunning. The black satin dress accentuated her curves, and her high heels transformed her steps into statements. As they got out of the car, she smiled at Lucas and took his arm, as if fulfilling a role she knew well. He realized the gesture was more acted than felt, but he kept quiet. He felt out of place, like an extra in a play where the lead role no longer belonged to him. Still, he walked beside her, trying to maintain some connection, trying to believe that this was just another chapter in a turbulent time. While she lost herself in greetings and laughter, he chose to retreat to a discreet corner of the room. He chatted with a few colleagues, observing the familiar faces framed by the ambient music and the formal speeches that emerged amid toasts and smiles. It didn't take long for him to realize Laura was no longer around. She moved around easily, stopping at tables, laughing loudly, exchanging glances. Lucas, even from a distance, recognized something uncomfortable in that glow, an excess of freedom that clashed with the commitment that still bound them. He tried to ignore it. He tried not to look. He tried to convince himself it was just his insecurity getting the better of him. But a restlessness grew within him, almost physical. It was then that he noticed her gaze fixed on someone across the room. An older man, with a confident posture, a smile that showed he knew he was being watched. Lucas didn't know him well, only by sight, as one of the company's leaders, someone high up in the ranks who rarely mingled with others. But there, In that moment, their posture spoke louder than any conversation. When Laura's eyes met his, there was a clear tension, an electricity Lucas had never seen between them. And it was then that something in his chest tightened. It wasn't pain yet, but it was the harbinger of it. The kind of sensation that warns that a fall is near, even when everything around seems still standing. Laura returned to his side shortly after, with a hurried smile and a kiss on the cheek that felt more like a greeting than affection. She told him the night was beautiful, the lights were perfect, the music was good. He nodded. He responded politely. And inside, he just waited. There was a lump in his throat that prevented any real conversation. Everything that had once been natural now felt scripted. Every sentence, every touch, every gesture was shrouded in a kind of absence that left him suffocated. She seemed radiant, while he cringed inside. And so the night progressed, amidst dancing, speeches, and toasts, until the lights dimmed, and the dance floor became the center of attention. The music changed. An enveloping, romantic rhythm filled the room. Couples began to form, laughter and exchanged glances filling the room with an almost theatrical intimacy. Lucas watched from a distance, glass in hand, gaze fixed. That's when he saw the man approach Laura. There was no hesitation. He extended his hand. She accepted it without looking back. She stood and walked to the center of the dance floor, as if it were the most natural of acts. The two began to dance. And there, in that space illuminated only by the soft overhead lights, everything revealed itself without words. The glances were too long, the smiles too intimate. There was no longer room for doubt. Lucas felt the air thin. The world around him slowed down. That woman he knew in every detail now surrendered herself to another with a lightness he didn't recognize. The movements flowed as if rehearsed. She smiled, he whispered something in her ear, and she laughed, throwing her head back. It was a kind of exposed, raw intimacy, and for a second, Lucas wondered if he was the only one seeing it with the clarity of someone witnessing the end of a cycle. He couldn't move. He was trapped in that moment, watching, feeling every part of himself slowly shatter. Until, at the end of the song, came what no previous gesture had been able to confirm so brutally. He cupped her face with both hands and kissed her, right there, in front of everyone. A lingering kiss, unhurried, unashamed. And she didn't flinch. She responded as if there were nothing to lose, as if he, the man still wearing her wedding ring on his finger, didn't exist just a few feet away. Lucas felt the ground slip away from beneath his feet. The entire room seemed to collapse into silence. The voices around him became noise. He didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't make a scene. He simply placed his glass on the nearest table and walked toward the exit. Each step was an effort not to collapse right there. The night, which began with a promise of reunion, ended with a certainty, it was all over. Outside, the wind seemed to mock his attempt to appear resolute. The city lights no longer glowed. Cars passed by, indifferent to his pain. And he, standing on the sidewalk, understood that there are betrayals that don't need words. Some pains speak for themselves, with gestures, looks, silences. And this, definitely, was one of them. Hours later, at home, with the apartment plunged into darkness, Lucas heard the door open. Laura entered slowly, as if trying not to be noticed. When she turned on the light, she found him sitting in the armchair, motionless. She hesitated, put her bag on the table, tried to smile. But there was something in his gaze that made her silence. She knew. She knew he had seen it. She didn't try to deny it. She simply murmured, her voice almost cracking, "You weren't supposed to see it like that." And in that moment, more than anger, more than sadness, what he felt was a complete emptiness. A loss that can't be shouted, but that corrodes from the inside out. Laura walked to the bedroom in silence. Lucas remained in the living room for hours, motionless, staring at a fixed point on the floor. He knew nothing would ever be the same again. He knew that night marked the end of a story. But what he didn't yet know, was that there was something more. Something she hadn't said. A detail that would make everything even more cruel. A closely guarded secret, about to be revealed. And when it came to light, what was already pain would become irreversible. The next morning, the apartment still carried the silence of the previous dawn, as if the air had grown denser, heavier. Laura had slept in the bedroom, and Lucas didn't have the strength to go in. He spent the entire night in the living room, sitting motionless, trying to reorganize the thoughts that came and went like fierce waves. The image of her on the dance floor was an open wound that stung with each attempt at comprehension. He didn't cry. He was beyond that. The pain no longer found an outlet through his eyes, only accumulated in his chest, suffocating in silence. The sound of the shower turning on in the morning shook him from his torpor. She was getting ready to leave, as if it were just another day. That hurt him again. The ease with which she moved, as if she hadn't crossed a line of no return. Lucas got up slowly, walked into the kitchen, and made coffee. Hearing her footsteps in the hallway, the hairdryer running, the closet door closing, it all felt surreal. They were under the same roof, but in opposite worlds. She appeared shortly after, dressed in a light blazer and with her hair still damp. Seeing him, she hesitated for a moment, then approached. Her gaze was tense, but there was a certain control, as if she wanted to steer the conversation without losing hers. He said nothing. He simply pushed a mug of coffee toward her and waited. She sat at the table, stared at the cup, as if the gesture meant something, but she didn't know how to interpret it. Finally, she took a deep breath and broke the silence. She said she wanted to talk, that things had gotten mixed up, that nothing had been planned, that she didn't want to hurt him, but that everything had gotten out of control. The words came in fits and starts, between pauses, as if she were still choosing what to reveal. Lucas remained silent. He watched her every gesture, every movement of her fingers, her uneven breathing, her trembling voice trying to find a firm hold. He then asked, in a deep voice, what it all meant. If it was over. If she wanted to leave. Laura took a while to answer. She said she didn't know. That she felt lost. That she hadn't expected things to escalate to that extent. That the kiss hadn't been planned. That it all started with conversations, professional admiration, an exchange of confidences. That she felt seen. Valued. That there was need, but also guilt. That she was torn. Lucas listened to everything without interrupting. Not because he was willing to understand, but because he needed to hear from her that everything he felt was right. It was only after minutes that she began to cry. Not a dramatic cry, but a restrained sob, like someone ashamed of their own pain. She said she'd made a mistake. That she knew she'd made a mistake. That perhaps she'd lost something she'd never find again. Lucas watched her, but he felt no pity. He felt grief. It was like burying a story he'd cared for with his own hands. When she apologized, he merely nodded. But there was more. Something in her posture betrayed that wasn't all. He noticed. He then asked if there was something she wasn't saying. The question hung in the air like a threat. Laura stood still, her face wet with tears, her eyes fixed on the mug. The silence stretched so long he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in the quietest voice she'd ever used, she confessed. She said that, in fact, that trip they had always dreamed of taking, the one they had planned together for so long, which they had envisioned as a milestone in their relationship, as a celebration of love, she had taken. Alone. 2 weeks before the company party. She took a quiet vacation, didn't tell anyone at work, told Lucas she would be at a marketing event out of town. He bought the tickets, booked the hotel, and headed to their destination. She didn't go after herself. He went after something she didn't yet understand. And there, among the cobblestone streets, the seaside cafes, the places named in their dreams, she felt his absence like a ghostly presence. She saw couples walking hand in hand and thought it could be them. She heard the music he always played in the car and cried. She smelled warm bread in the same bakery they had discovered in a magazine years before and wanted to go back in time. But she didn't. Because in that place, between memories and idealizations, she was forced to face the choice she had made. Lucas looked at her in astonishment. He asked, his voice firm, if she had really gone alone. And then came the missing answer. She hesitated, her gaze averted, her hands clasped in her lap. She said no. That, yes, on the first day she was alone. But on the second, he, the man from the party, the boss, the other, arrived. They spent days together. They shared a room. They visited the places she had promised to visit with Lucas. They experienced, however briefly, the journey that was theirs. Lucas recoiled, as if he had been punched. The pain was immediate, sharp, but there was no cry. He closed his eyes, stood up slowly, as if trying to control his body so as not to collapse on the spot. She tried to say more, to explain, but he held up his hand. Said there was no need. That now everything made sense. Laura was crying for real now. She said she regretted it as soon as he left. That, seeing him at the party, standing at the door with that expression of someone who just lost everything, she felt the impact of her mistake. But he didn't have the courage to tell her then. Or in the days that followed. Because she knew he wouldn't forgive her. She knew that secret was the last straw on something that was already dying. Lucas asked her why, of all people, of all moments, she chose that trip. Why she'd turned something so symbolic into an act of betrayal. She couldn't answer. He said maybe it was an attempt to erase what she felt. To try to kill the old feeling with a new one. To see if something would rise from the ashes. But all that was born was guilt. Silence fell over the room again. Lucas walked to the window, looked out at the city, the cars, the life happening outside. And then, with a hoarse voice, he said he now understood that the betrayal wasn't just a kiss, a touch, a body. It was a choice. A conscious deviation from everything they'd built. He said she could have walked away, could have asked for time, could have been honest. But she chose to lie. She chose to live a parallel life based on dreams that were both theirs. He said that, because of this, there was no room for return. That forgiveness might come one day, but the love she had killed alone, with every gesture, every omission. Laura tried to get closer, but he backed away. He said he needed to be alone. That he needed to think. That he didn't know where he would sleep that night, but he knew it wasn't home anymore. He grabbed his car keys and wallet and left. She stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by furniture, mementos, and framed photographs. Everything so beautiful. Everything so dead. What was supposed to be a new beginning on that trip had become an end. And now, all that remained was absence. But what Lucas didn't yet know, was that fate had something unexpected in store for him. Something born of pain, loss, and the courage to start over. Something that would transform everything. Even the things he thought were impossible. Lucas spent days away. Not out of pride, not out of emotional strategy, but out of survival instinct. He needed to breathe fresh air, hear other voices around him, look away from the walls that had watched from a front row seat to the ruin of his love. He left the apartment in a hurry, but took almost nothing, just his wallet, his cell phone, his car keys, and a coat. He slept on the couch at a friend's house who didn't ask questions and, therefore, offered the only shelter he needed, silence. He didn't respond to Laura's messages or answer her calls. All her attempts to contact him turned into unanswered calls and texts deleted before they could even be read. He didn't want to hear any more. He already knew everything he needed. Her confession had been clear, devastating, definitive. The kind of truth that leaves no room for explanations or second thoughts. Yet something inside him still simmered, not longing, not doubt, but unease. A nagging feeling that there was more. As if even after so much pain, there remained a hidden layer of everything that had happened. Something she had omitted. One last detail capable of tearing apart what remained. For days later, he returned to the apartment. He found the space as he had left it, tidy, but lifeless. The rooms no longer carried the scent of home, and the photos on the walls seemed to mock his naivete. Laura was sitting on the living room sofa, wearing sweatpants, her eyes sunken, her expression vacant. She looked like she hadn't slept. Or maybe she hadn't even slept since the last time he had walked out that door. Seeing him, she stood up abruptly, as if his presence were her last chance to regain what she had lost. But he remained standing in the doorway, without taking a step forward. His gaze was steady, his face expressionless. She tried to speak, but he held up his hand. He said he didn't want to hear any more excuses, that he already knew everything, that he had already accepted. He said he was only there to get his things, nothing more. The impact of those words was visible on her face, but what he didn't expect was her reaction. Laura didn't burst into tears, didn't beg, didn't try to convince him with empty promises. She simply said that if he was truly ready to go, then he deserved to know everything. Not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a reckoning. The silence that followed was the heaviest of all. Laura walked to the bookshelf, picked up an envelope, and handed it to Lucas. He hesitated for a second before opening it. Inside was a photo. A single photo. And when he saw it, the world seemed to spin upside down. It was a common yet devastating image. The restaurant they had chosen for their wedding anniversary, the same table on the balcony, their favorite bottle of wine in the background. Sitting there, laughing, holding hands, were Laura and the man she had cheated on him with. It was the trip. Their trip. But in that frozen-in-time snapshot, what hurt wasn't just the fact that she had taken another man. It was the scene itself, meticulously crafted as if it were a reenactment of what should have been lived with him. It was as if she had erased his face from memory and replaced it with another, without even hesitating. Lucas, still in shock, asked why she kept that photo. Laura lowered her eyes and answered hoarsely, almost breaking. She said she had kept it because that was when everything inside her fell apart. That image, taken by a waiter at the man's request, was the trigger for her regret. That the moment she looked at the photo for the first time, she felt the blow of reality. That she saw the absurdity of everything she had done. That nothing there was hers. That everything at that table, in that setting, in that rehearsed gesture, belonged to Lucas. And that trying to live that moment with another was like betraying her twice, first him, then herself. Lucas was breathing heavily, but still maintained his composure. He asked why she hadn't told him before, why she'd hidden that detail. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, holding back tears, and said she hadn't told him because she felt ashamed. Because she knew there was no way to pretend it was just a mistake. That by reliving their trip with another man, she had crossed the last line of respect. And worst of all, even after everything, it still took her a while to understand the depth of the hole she'd dug. She said she tried to convince herself she was seeking freedom, but only found emptiness. That she spent the rest of the trip in silence, crying hidden in the hotel bathroom while he slept, feeling more alone than she had ever felt, even with company. Lucas remained silent for long minutes, his eyes fixed on that photo. The image seemed to burn in his hands. He remembered the conversation they'd had when they'd chosen that restaurant, the day they'd researched reviews together, the way he'd smiled when she'd shown him the menu on her phone and said, "This will be our special dinner." It was theirs. A piece of history she'd desecrated. And, more than that, one she'd tried to replace. He then asked, dryly, if she'd loved that man. Laura replied no. That she'd never felt anything for him beyond admiration and need. That she'd confused attention with passion. But she loved him, Lucas. And that was precisely what made her fall apart when she returned. He dropped the photo on the couch as if it were something toxic. He ran his hands over his face, paced back and forth. And then he asked her what motivated her to go on that trip. What made her, precisely at that moment, decide to transform something so symbolic into an act of destruction? Laura hesitated, looked at the floor, and confessed something Lucas didn't yet know. He said that, days before the trip, she had found an old video of the two of them on his phone. A video of them laughing, lying in bed, talking about the future. It showed him saying, "When we go on our trip, I want to see you wearing that blue dress you wore on our first date." And she, laughing, replied, "You only say that because that dress is tight around my waist and you like to see me complaining all the time." They laughed together. It was a simple but vivid memory. And she, seeing it, felt a pain she couldn't bear. She said that, in a cowardly and impulsive act, she wanted to erase that memory. She wanted to rewrite history. As if, by living that dream with someone else, she could numb the guilt of not having been able to preserve it with someone who truly deserved it. Lucas listened without interrupting, but each word fell like a blade. Because what hurt now was no longer the betrayal, nor the kiss at the party, nor the desecrated trip. It was knowing she loved him. That she still loved him. That everything was done out of cowardice, out of confusion, out of a lack of courage to face what she felt. Because true love doesn't save when there's no maturity. Because sometimes, those who love us most are the ones who destroy us most, not out of malice, but out of emotional turmoil. And that, for Lucas, was the most unforgivable of all. Because the pain of losing someone to heartbreak is different from the pain of losing someone to one's own ill-treated love. The first is accepted. The second is carried. He looked at her one last time. He said he didn't feel hate, but he also didn't feel love anymore. That there was a kind of death that happens before physical death. And that in that relationship, the burial had already taken place. He said he wanted her to find peace, but that his would only come far from her. And then, with firm steps, he left the apartment without looking back. Laura fell to her knees on the floor, embracing her guilt, holding the photo with trembling hands. She knew there was no going back. That no plea, no confession, no gesture of despair would erase what had been done. And that the only thing left for her now was to live with the echo of a story she herself chose to destroy. Lucas never returned. He didn't text, he didn't call, he didn't leave a note. Her number remained saved in his phone, but silenced, like a ghost he'd learned to ignore. Over time, the calls stopped, and the texts stopped arriving. Laura didn't pursue it after that. She knew she'd already crossed all lines. The days dragged on, and the apartment that once pulsated with life now felt like a tomb of wilted flowers. She walked through each room as if treading on the rubble of a home she'd imploded. She tried to fill her time with anything, organizing drawers, cleaning out closets, redesigning routines. But in every object, in every corner, there was a vivid memory, an echo of the life she'd once had and thrown away with her own hands. The photographs, once untouchable, were tucked away in a box she hid at the back of the closet, as if that could bury the pain, as if holding on to the past would prevent it from crushing her every day. On the other side of the city, Lucas was rediscovering himself. There was no rush, no euphoria, just a kind of slow, solid rebuilding. He began walking in the mornings, frequenting cafes that had never been part of his old routine, sitting on park benches where he could observe the world without being observed. It was strange, at first, to be completely alone. But gradually, this silence became comfort. It was in this process that he met Helena, someone who arrived without intention, without promising anything, without demanding a cure. She didn't have Laura's features, didn't speak like her, didn't laugh like her. And perhaps that was precisely why it was possible. Helena was calm, serene, with a listening gaze and a presence that didn't pressure. She worked with old books, knew too many stories, and maintained silence with a lightness Lucas had never experienced. Their first encounter occurred in a local bookstore, when he was looking for a specific title that she had, by chance, just returned. They exchanged a few words, a brief laugh, and said goodbye like two strangers who knew they might never see each other again. But chance, or time, seemed determined to forge new paths. Days later, they met again in the same place. And then, once more, at a nearby cafe. Until their conversations became routine and their absences began to be missed. Lucas still carried wounds, but he didn't project them onto her. Helena, for her part, didn't try to heal him. She was simply there. Present, whole, honest. He told his story slowly, unhurriedly, without dramatization. When he revealed everything he'd experienced, she didn't respond with advice or judgment, simply holding his hand firmly, as if understanding without needing to say anything. It was then that Lucas understood the difference between loving intensely and loving maturely. The love he'd experienced before consumed him, leaving him alert and anxious. What was emerging now was calm, secure, and untroubled. Laura learned about Helena by chance, through a mutual colleague who mentioned seeing Lucas with her at a bookstore. At first, she didn't react. But the information was planted in her mind like a poisonous seed. Not out of jealousy. It was something else. It was the realization that he had moved on. That, despite all the damage, he had found another path. While she, there, stagnant, relived the same cycle of regret every day. She began to dream about him. Confusing dreams, where he said he never loved her, or where she begged for forgiveness, or where they simply sat in silence, in places that didn't exist. She woke with her heart racing, her breathing ragged, as if the early mornings were punishing her for everything she hadn't had the courage to face in real life. One afternoon, months later, Laura decided to visit the restaurant from her trip. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was a desperate attempt to put that memory to rest. She got in her car and drove without much thought, as if driven by something greater than reason. When she arrived, she found the same scene. The same tables, the same smell of the sea, the same piercing silence between one couple's laughter and the next. She ordered the same wine. She sat alone, in the same chair as in the photo. And there, with no one around, she let herself cry for real. It wasn't a restrained, embarrassed tear anymore. It was a full, deep cry, welling up from her belly, as if her entire body had finally surrendered to the pain her soul had carried for so long. There was no audience, no interruptions. Just her and her regret, looking into each other's eyes for the first time. That same night, Lucas was leaving the cinema with Helena. They had gone to see a French drama she had insisted on seeing. During the film, she held his hand almost the entire time, and he realized he no longer felt the weight of old memories. He no longer compared, no longer expected specific reactions. He simply lived. And that, after all, was a victory. On the way back, she mentioned a bookstore that would be opening an exhibition of rare editions that weekend. He agreed to accompany her. He smiled lightly, like he hadn't in a long time. And, without realizing it, he began to tell her about a new project he was thinking about developing. Helena listened attentively, asking questions, encouraging. This wasn't just a new relationship. It was a genuine new beginning. A cycle that opened without having to erase what came before, but also without carrying what no longer made sense. Months turned into a year. And over time, Lucas formalized his separation from Laura definitively. They resolved the bureaucratic issues and divided their assets civilly. There were no arguments. He was direct. He said he no longer held a grudge, but that there was no possibility of getting back together. She listened in silence. She signed the papers with steady hands, though her eyes betrayed the pain. At the end, as he stood to leave, she asked if he was happy. Lucas thought for a moment. He said he was at peace. And that, sometimes, that was worth more than happiness. She smiled, but it was short-lived. Because she knew it wasn't a disguised maybe. It was a full stop. Later, when Lucas arrived home, he found Helena on the sofa, leafing through a book. She looked at him, smiled, and asked how he was feeling. He sat beside her, rested his head on her shoulder, and said that for the first time in a long time, he felt everything was in place. That there were no more loose ends. That, even without understanding all the whys and wherefores of life, he was where he was supposed to be. Helena didn't respond. She just hugged him. And in that embrace, there was everything: respect, complicity, renewal. Laura, on the other side, was walking through a park. It was autumn, and the leaves fell like memories. She sat on a bench and watched couples passing by, mothers with children, young people with headphones on. She took out her phone, opened the gallery, and found an old photo from the trip. The same one she had shown Lucas. For the first time, she didn't cry. She just stared at the image, like someone finally accepting the consequences of their own choices. She put the phone in her pocket, closed her eyes, and lay there, listening to the wind. She knew true love had passed her by. And that she had let it go. Not for lack of love, but for not knowing how to protect it. For not knowing how to care for it. For not understanding, at the right time, that some things cannot be repeated. Lucas now knew. He knew the value of silence, of respect, of partnership. He knew how hard it was to rebuild oneself after being shattered from within. And so, Helena's every gesture was received with reverence. Not because she healed his pain. But because she arrived when he had already learned to heal himself. Their love wasn't a patch. It was a seed. It grew from the fertile soil that pain had once tilled. And so, between new beginnings and absences, between honest endings and necessary silences, each carried on. One with the weight of memory, the other with the lightness of rebirth. Because some mistakes cost more than one imagines. And there are loves that, once lost, are never repeated. The definitive end between Lucas and Laura didn't happen with screams, nor with tears as doors slammed or accusations spat between clenched teeth. Their end was a tepid whisper, a succession of empty stares where hope once resided. They crossed paths for the last time in a neutral office, signed papers, exchanged formalities. And, although everything occurred within a civilized ritual, there was a latent wound between them that no agreement or division of assets could staunch. Laura left the room without looking back, while Lucas remained for a few more minutes staring at the already stamped sheet of paper, his signature beneath a line that put a period to what had once been the central plot of his life. He felt no relief, no heaviness, only a piercing lucidity, like someone finally understanding that love is not enough when there is no reciprocity in the care. Life was now being rebuilt at a different pace. Lucas had moved, opting for a smaller, more intimate apartment where he could begin without the ghosts of a closed story. Helena began to frequent the new space frequently, though they still maintained separate homes. There was a subtle dance of respect for time between them, a care not to disrupt the natural process that both seemed to understand without needing to discuss it. She knew about his past, not with the discomfort of someone competing with memories, but with the maturity of someone who understands that every new love needs enough space to breathe, and that includes allowing the old one to be buried with dignity. Lucas, for his part, never compared. The story with Laura had been intense, but now it was a closed book on his life's shelf, a work he might never reread, but which, in some way, helped shape who he was. Still, there were traces. Some nights were filled with involuntary thoughts, images that emerged from nowhere, like surviving memories of a shipwreck. A gesture he saw on the street, a scent wafting through the air, a word spoken out of context, any detail could evoke the bittersweet sensation of everything he'd experienced. But there was no desire to return, nor any active resentment. It was simply the mark of something profound. Helena knew how to recognize these moments in his eyes. When she saw him distant, she didn't demand anything. She simply remained, silent, present, whole. And deep down, Lucas felt that this solid, respectful presence was precisely what he'd never experienced before. With her, there were no doubts, no games, no fears. Only the certainty that true love isn't revealed in euphoria, but in constancy. Meanwhile, Laura faced her new reality. She tried hard to return to her professional routine, investing in projects, participating in events, striving to demonstrate control and balance. On the outside, she managed to maintain an image of self-sufficiency. Inside, she was merely a ruin sustained by the force of habit. Loneliness, now, wasn't a lack of companionship, but an absence of meaning. No conversation, no new interaction could fill the exact space Lucas occupied. Not because he was perfect, but because she knew, with painful clarity, that no one would love her that way anymore. That no one would put coffee on the stove before leaving for work anymore, that no one would remember the day she absent-mindedly mentioned how much she liked daisies and showed up with a vase of them on any given Wednesday. That no one would look at her with that mixture of admiration and tenderness that only those who truly see another person completely can offer. One afternoon, sitting in a neighborhood coffee shop, Laura saw a couple who reminded her of them. It was an almost cruel sight, the synchronized gestures, the suppressed laughter between sips of coffee, the knowing looks. It unsettled her in a way she couldn't have anticipated. It wasn't envy, it was grief. A living grief for something that still breathed within her, even after so many months. She still hadn't forgiven herself. And perhaps she never would. Because the pain of regret doesn't come from the loss itself, but from the awareness that something that could have been preserved was lost. Betrayal, in her case, wasn't the result of a lack of love, but of an emotional immaturity that made her confuse presence with routine, affection with predictability, and freedom with recklessness. And now, all that remained was absence, not just of him, but of herself. She was no longer the woman she once was. There was no longer any shine in the mirror, no lightness in her laughter. Just the reflection of someone who discovered in the worst possible way the value of what he destroyed. Lucas, on the other hand, was taking firm steps. He started working at a new company, more aligned with his principles. He got involved in side projects and rediscovered old hobbies he'd forgotten about. On weekends, he and Helena explored hidden corners of the city, participated in street fairs, and watched plays and movies that sparked long conversations into the wee hours. Hers wasn't a love that erased his former love, but a love that illuminated new places within him, spaces he hadn't even known existed. And, over time, the wound turned into a scar. It still hurt when touched, but it no longer bled. The dilemma, however, would present itself unexpectedly. One day, Lucas received a call from Laura's mother. She was a kind woman who had always treated him with affection even after their separation. The call was brief, but long enough to leave him silent for minutes after hanging up. Laura had asked to see him. She didn't want to return. She didn't want reconciliation. She just wanted to talk. One last meeting. A soul-searching session. Helena, upon finding out, didn't react with jealousy. She simply said he should go if he felt the need. Lucas hesitated. The idea of reliving ghosts made him tense. But there was a hint of humanity in accepting. And deep down, a part of him wanted to end this once and for all, not with a signed document, but with dignity. The meeting was scheduled for a late afternoon, on a park bench. Laura was different. Thinner, more serious, with the tired eyes of someone who no longer fought against time. When she saw him, she smiled toothlessly, a shy smile, full of fear. Lucas sat beside her and waited. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't play the victim. He simply said she needed to thank him. Because even with everything that had happened, he was the best she had. She said she recognized every gesture of love, every moment he tried to save them even when she was already on the other side of the bridge. She apologized, not for her actions, which had already been discussed, but for not being worthy of what he offered. She said she spent months trying to find herself, but that she understood that some versions of herself she would never recover. Lucas listened calmly. He said he forgave. Not for her. But for him. Because living with hurt is carrying another's poison in your blood. And that forgiveness wasn't a rapprochement, it was a release. They said goodbye without promises, without holding hands, without lingering glances. Each went their own way, as if that spot in the square were the final intersection of two destinies that no longer belonged together. Lucas returned home with a light heart. When Helena opened the door, he hugged her as if returning not from a journey, but from a journey. She didn't ask anything. He didn't explain. He simply kissed her and told her he was ready. And, for the first time, he knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't an end. It was the beginning of something that finally made sense. The rain fell lightly that Sunday afternoon, covering the city with a veil of almost poetic melancholy. Lucas looked out the window of his new house, a discreet two-story house on a quiet street, far from anything reminiscent of the past, as the sound of the raindrops mingled with the soft hiss of the instrumental music Helena had played in the background. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and for a moment, everything seemed silently harmonious. Still, there was a restlessness in his thoughts, something he hadn't shared with anyone since his final encounter with Laura on the park bench. Her face, so different from anything he'd ever remembered, wouldn't leave his mind. Not out of longing, not out of desire, but out of a kind of heavy compassion, the kind that carries the weight of what could have been, but wasn't. It was like looking at an old photograph and realizing that all the smiles there no longer belong to you, that they no longer make sense, even though you know exactly why you smiled at that moment. Helena appeared with 2 cups in her hands and sat beside him on the floor, near the window. Her gaze was serene but attentive. She noticed his every nuance without him needing to say anything. So when he let out a long sigh, she simply handed him the cup and waited. Lucas was silent for a few seconds, then blurted out almost involuntarily, "She's different, she's not the same person anymore." Helena nodded slightly, never taking her eyes off him. "And neither are you," she replied. The comment carried no judgment or jealousy, it was simply a reflection of the truth. He nodded. He said he saw her there, sitting, fragile, and wondered where the strong, confident woman he once knew was. But he also wondered what part of him, once so patient and protective, had disappeared along the way. "We change," he said, looking into his own cup as if searching for answers within. "Sometimes, it's what life demands. Other times, it's just what pain does to us." Helena gently touched his hand. "Or mistreated love," she added, needing no further explanation. In the following days, Lucas decided to take a break from work. He needed time to regroup, and partly because he also wanted to dedicate himself to a new project that had been slowly maturing, writing a book. Helena encouraged him with restrained enthusiasm, respecting his time but making it clear how much she admired his courage in transforming his scar into a narrative. It wouldn't be an autobiography, but the story of someone who had also loved, been betrayed, and rebuilt himself. The difference, however, was that the main character wouldn't seek justice or revenge. Only truth. Because that was what Lucas finally understood, the truth doesn't completely heal, but it allows pain to find a place to exist without consuming everything around it. It was during this writing process that he unexpectedly reconnected with himself. Reliving certain moments, even through fiction, was painful but also liberating. There were passages where words failed him, others where he wrote compulsively, as if exorcising everything that hadn't been said at the right time. Helena read each chapter with almost ritualistic attention. Sometimes she would stop, look up from the paper, and say, "This hurts." He would smile. It was supposed to hurt. And then she would retort, "But it also heals." And it was true. Each written sentence didn't erase the past, but rather gave him back control over his own story. No longer the story of someone betrayed, but of someone who had rebuilt himself with dignity. Laura, on the other hand, remained trapped within the invisible walls she had built. She was alone, yes, but it wasn't physical loneliness that tortured her. It was the existential void, the inability to belong to herself. She had friends, work, invitations to go out, but everything felt artificial. Every forced smile was followed by a deafening silence when I got home. The old box of photos and notes remained hidden in the back of the closet, and she sometimes allowed herself to open it just to confirm that all of it had truly existed, that it wasn't a figment of her needy mind. One of those nights, she found a note Lucas had left inside one of the books she'd read when they still lived together. The paper was yellowed, but the handwriting remained intact. It said, "Loving you is like waking up in the right place every day, even when the world seems wrong." She read it over and over, until the words lost their meaning and became only pain. A silent, contained pain that no longer needed tears, because she'd already used them all up. The dilemma, for Laura, became a moral one. Not just about what she did to Lucas, but about what she did to herself. For a long time, she tried to convince herself that the betrayal was a slip-up, an isolated error. But now she understood that it was a choice. She chose to lie, hide, sabotage. She chose not to fight. And most cruelly, she chose all of this against someone who had never treated her with disdain. The awareness of this wasn't external punishment, it was internal judgment. And, faced with it, there was no possible relief. Meanwhile, life moved on around Lucas at a different pace. He and Helena were invited to dinner at the home of mutual friends. It was a new group, people unfamiliar with his past, who saw him simply as a quiet, observant man with a measured voice and well-founded opinions. No one there associated his calm demeanor with the emotional devastation he had endured. And that, for him, was a relief. Finally, he could exist beyond the past. He no longer needed to explain, justify, or carry any scars as a badge. Helena blended in well with the group. She had light laughter, firm opinions, and a sweetness that was charming. On the way back, Lucas looked at her and said bluntly, "You brought back parts of me that I thought were lost forever." She held his hand and responded with a slow, silent kiss, as if understanding the depth of the words without needing to respond. But there was one last piece to this puzzle. A closure that needed to happen, even if he didn't know it. One day, as he was leaving the bookstore where Helena worked, Lucas spotted Laura across the street. She saw him too. For a second, the world seemed to stop. There were no more cars, buildings, or voices, just the gaze of two people who had once been everything to each other and were now nothing more than the past. Laura crossed the street slowly. She looked different. Her hair tied back, her face clean, her eyes more serene than he remembered. She stopped in front of him and simply said, "I read your interview." It was an article that had appeared on a literary blog about the book Lucas was writing. She mentioned that she recognized some passages. He smiled slightly. He said there was fiction, but also truth. She nodded. "It hurt to read," she confessed. Lucas looked her in the eyes. "It hurts to live, too," he replied. The conversation was short. She asked for nothing. He offered nothing. And perhaps it was precisely this lack of expectations that made their encounter a worthy conclusion. A closure without any open scars. Before they parted, Laura said, "I'm glad you found someone who knew how to love you like I didn't." And she meant it. For the first time, there was complete truth in her eyes. Lucas thanked her with a lingering look, and then continued on his way, with the peace of someone who finally understands that there is pain that time doesn't erase, but transforms into fertile soil for new paths. And that day, when he returned home, he found Helena waiting for him with a cup of tea on the porch, a blanket draped over her shoulders, and a peaceful smile. He sat beside her, looked up at the cloudy sky, and said, "I closed a door today, for good." She simply leaned closer, rested her head on his shoulder, and said, "That's why the windows are all open now." And they were. Every single one of them. Prepared for what was to come next. Time passed. Not much, but enough for the sharpest pains to give way to a stillness difficult to explain. The kind of silence that no longer hurts, but also brings no relief. It's just the emptiness that remains after the storm, when the damage is still there, visible, but the will to repair it is gone. Lucas continued building his life with firm, discreet steps. The book was published to good reception. It wasn't a resounding success, but it reached the right people, those who, like him, had already felt the ground disappear beneath their feet. He gained recognition in literary circles, was invited to several events, and participated in debates on loss, new beginnings, and emotional boundaries. He spoke little about what he experienced, but those who listened to him perceived that behind every sentence lay a scar, a pain digested, transformed into words. With Helena, he found balance. Their relationship matured with a moving naturalness. They didn't promise each other eternity, only presence, and that was what sustained everything. With her, he learned to take a deep breath before reacting, to talk before concluding, to trust before suspecting. Not out of naivete, but out of acquired wisdom. He no longer sought proof of love, a consistent gesture, a care without demands, a silent touch that said everything without a single word was enough. His life found a new rhythm. On weekends, they spent hours at the bookstore where Helena continued to work passionately, assembling display cases with poems hidden among the books, like secret messages for anyone who paid attention. One morning, she surprised him with a note hidden between the pages of a copy he had written himself. It simply said, "Some new beginnings are so gentle they seem written by divine hands. Thank you for being mine." Lucas held on to it like someone who holds on to a piece of himself. This wasn't just love. It was healing. It was redemption after ruin. Meanwhile, Laura continued her journey alone, though she now had a clearer understanding of who she was. The reunion with Lucas, however brief, served as a final point in the narrative she insisted on keeping alive in her own mind. He no longer harbored hope, but neither did he harbor self-pity. He began therapy, something he had always avoided for fear of what he would find within himself. And it was there, between silent sessions and painful confrontations, that he began to understand the extent of the hole he had dug with his own hands. He admitted his mistakes, but more than that, he began to recognize the mechanisms that led him to commit them. He began to write too. Not a book, not for the public, but for herself. Notebooks and notebooks filled with souvenirs, apologies that would never be sent, questions that might never be answered. There, he found a kind of catharsis. Not relief, but acceptance. Life was not kind to her in the following months. She lost her job after a company layoff, faced financial difficulties, and had to move to a smaller apartment. Friends who had previously been close drifted away, not out of contempt, but because life followed its own rhythms. And she understood, in the starkest way, that when true love is destroyed, you don't just lose the person, you also lose the bonds, the stories, the ground. Certain losses leave holes through which the entire world seems to slip. On a particularly cold night, sitting alone on the couch, staring at the box containing the memories of a relationship that no longer exists, she finally understood that some mistakes can't be fixed with apologies. There are damages that cannot be repaired. And the greatest of them was having lost the respect of the one who respected her most. This realization didn't make her crumble. Quite the opposite. From that moment on, she began to build a new version of herself. One that didn't seek external comfort, but internal responsibility. She no longer expected redemption, only clarity. On the other side, Lucas was preparing a new book, this time less intimate, more observant. He had become someone who spoke lightly but left a mark. People approached him seeking answers, and he gradually learned to admit he didn't have them all. One day, at a lecture on forgiveness and new beginnings, a young man raised his hand and asked, "Have you truly forgiven the person who betrayed you?" Lucas thought for a moment. He looked at the audience and replied, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting what they did to you, it's stopping allowing it to continue to define you. Today, that betrayal is just a story I lived, not the story of who I am." The audience fell silent. Not for lack of reaction, but because those words touched wounds that many hid even from themselves. Months later, Helena and Lucas traveled to the countryside, to one of those silent retreats she loved so much. It was a secluded spot, surrounded by trees, where the only sound was the wind touching the leaves and the rustle of book pages. There, sitting by a lake, he handed her an envelope. Inside was a text he'd written the night before he met Helena. It was about the exact moment he decided to stop looking back. At the end of the text, he'd handwritten, "I didn't know life could be good again until you showed me it could." She hugged him without saying a word, and in that instant, he knew he was ready for whatever the future held. There was no longer any fear. There was no longer any shadow. Only the present, whole, true, possible. Laura also traveled. She decided to take, alone, the last trip she and Lucas had dreamed of together, but without repeating it, this time, to a new place. A country she'd always wanted to visit but never had the courage to go. And there, among strangers, he finally found a quiet freedom, not from guilt, but from the past. Looking out to sea, sitting on the cold sand at dusk, she wrote in her journal, "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, but today I understand that making mistakes with someone who loves you is easy. Living with it is what's hard." She closed the notebook and sat there, silent, watching the horizon, as if she knew she might never love someone the same way again, but that, at least, she learned, even if the hard way, what it means to cherish a love. The story of these three characters doesn't end with reconciliation, nor with major twists and turns, but with life being what it is, complex, hard, yet capable of offering new beginnings to those who have the courage to face the consequences of their own choices. Because in the end, love doesn't survive where there is no truth. And betrayal, when it strikes, doesn't just destroy the bond, it destroys the history, the trust, the time invested, and the image each had of the other. But, most importantly, it destroys the perpetrator. Not in the act, but later. When they realize they've lost what no other love can ever give back. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? How did you feel? Which character touched you the most? I'd love to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive more stories as exciting as this one. Your presence here makes all the difference. And remember, betrayal destroys homes, breaks bonds that took years to build, and leaves invisible scars that we carry forever. Nothing justifies hurting someone you love. True love cares for, protects, and honors. Here on this channel, we do not support, do not normalize, and will never romanticize any type of betrayal. Until the next story. And may it be made with respect.